right. Hi, everybody. It's our CFB Talk 149. It's Tuesday night. And just astonishing how much has happened since we left off last Tuesday, because really everything started to go wild. So I guess, that's great. That's what we were kind of expecting to happen earlier in the season, perhaps in February, and here we are, August. Why not? Let's have everything go completely off the rails in August. So that's what we have now. We're not really necessarily getting as hyped for the season like we normally do. We're just here to actually let's start talking about what's going on everywhere in college football. So before we begin, and I see we already have someone who wants to come up to talk, and we want to hear from you. If you hit request, we'll let you up and we can hear your voice and add it to the conversation. I just wanted to say we've started to do a few more guests. We're actually starting tomorrow at noon Eastern. We're going to have none other than Phil Steele, the man who creates probably our favorite football preview guide. I've been reading Phil Steele's college football guide since long before Reddit, at least college football Reddit, ever existed. So that's going to be excited to have him for show 150. We actually had him for show number 50. It just sort of coincidentally ended up that way. So recommend, if you like listening to a little bit more interview style, we're going to be having Phil Steele tomorrow at noon Eastern. But all that said, let's go ahead and bring some folks up here. I see Go Tigers. I'm going to go ahead and let you up. And I know we're going to have a few more people who want to come up and join. So you're all welcome to be a part of the conversation. What's going on?
LSU's winning the national championship.
Didn't you call last week and say that too?
Yeah.
I love the commitment. Yeah, we talked about that. I mean, LSU certainly has a path. It's not like completely unheard of. So, I mean, they, Brian Kelly can coach. He's got seemingly a great depth of talent there. I don't think there's any reason why it isn't possible. I mean, well, there are reasons why it might not be possible. And of course, they're Alabama, LSU at all. And Auburn's now finally recruiting again. I've been reading all about what's going on there under Freeze. But, I mean, LSU's got the ability to do it. It's great to hear from you. I want to go ahead and shift over to Ozzy Maverick. You've been patient. What's going on there, man?
Yeah, I think that last person is one of the most insanely idiotic people I've ever heard of. At no point in his incoherent ramblings that he represent anything that represents a rational thought.
So I've got someone else who wants to come up here. Looks like my co-host Andrew wants to join here. People got pretty hot over there. I know. It's good to have rivalry. It's good to see LSU and Arkansas fans. Again, if you'd like to talk about anything in college football, feel free to raise up your hand. But yeah, so I just want to obviously catch up a little bit for those who may have somehow been under a rock since we were last here. On Wednesday, that was because we do these Tuesday night. On Wednesday, all hell broke loose with Colorado rumored to leave. And then pretty quick, we saw things kind of go off the rails. I mean, it's so fun to kind of go back and look at the headlines. I mean, Colorado, Pete Thamel was saying, Colorado's in discussions about a move to the Big 12. And then within a day, we hear Brett McMurphy, basically saying that Colorado is leaving the Big 12. And, within a few days from that, Colorado it was basically as quick as a little over a year ago when USC and UCLA bolted. Like that one was a total surprise. Here, people knew Colorado was kind of interested, just like Arizona's been kind of interested in going to the Big 12. But then overnight, poof, suddenly it was enacted. The Big 12 is ready to accept them. I do really deeply get a kick out of the entirety of the statement from Brett Yormark was they're back. So again, as some of the Colorado fans have been joking, we went to get a pack of smokes from the corner store and vanished for 10 years, but we're back. So here we go again. But hey, I see we have someone else who wants to come up here, but I first wanted to just hear from you. Andrew, what's going on?
Not too much. How are you doing, my friend?
Good. It's been fun offseason. I mean, obviously the Pac-12 had their meeting today, and we're getting all the reports on what that media deal was. I don't think we have the exact details, but all the reports seem to indicate it was primarily a streaming online kind of contract with Apple, using Apple Plus, Apple TV, with some kind of, I guess, clause where if they manage to pull in subscribers, the amount of the agreement could reach the Big 12, because the Big 12 is getting like $31 million per team, Right now, it sounds like, and we were getting indications of this before whatever the meeting was today. And again, we don't know the exact details; it hasn't been leaked. But basically, the Pac-12 is saying, okay, we can get all of you 20 million or so, but there are potential, I love the quote, escalators in the clause, which, I mean, hey, escalators turn into stairs if they break. But, escalators into this particular deal where it could go above the Big 12's contract. However, and I really agree with, I mean, Stuart Mandel, he put it best. He's like, look, Larry Scott told the schools on that the Pac-12 network was going to he sold them on it because I remember this. The Pac-12 network was actually a really interesting idea when it was proposed, over a decade ago. The idea was, hey, if we fully own this network and it really takes off and does what the Big Ten network did, we won't have to share this pot of money with Fox or who is the partner with the Big Ten network. And of course, we all know that just did not work. That completely imploded, and it didn't go anywhere. The Dish network is like only when you could get it on. That's been the running gag. I mean, Arizona's board of regents for the entire Arizona, I think, school system was meeting, and they immediately went into a private executive meeting so no one could listen in. And the joke was that might mean they're staying in the Pac-12 because they made it impossible to follow what was going on in their discussions. But yeah, so that's where we are now. But that's on my mind, Andrew. How about yourself?
Well, it's UCF is a month into its new conference, and it's already going through another round of realignment. It's very interesting. I can tell you from personal experience, as well as talking to UCF fans, we're very fortunate that we're in a stable conference now. Not that the AAC wasn't stable, but a stable P5 conference, I guess you could say. And, it's tough to see the Pac-12 going through this. I mean, as much as I have Schadenfreude about how Scott and whoever their new commissioner is,
George Kliavkov. Yeah.
Kliavkov, Gesundheit. Oh, by the way, that was an amazing dad joke about the escalator and stairs.
I can't even claim that. I think that was that one's probably been done to the death. I mean, at this point, we're looking at, the other thing that came up, and I know SI reported that if Arizona leaves to the Big 12 and Arizona State stays in the Pac-12, and that's the weird part. Arizona State, I know Arizona, I think to the credit of Arizona, their president, Robert Robbins, has been way more aggressive in saying, like, look, we will consider the Big 12, but we want to see the Pac-12 deal first. And now they've heard the Pac-12 deal, so maybe this is the moment they bolt. But at the same time, Arizona State has been kind of, fine, I guess, with staying in the conference. From what I understand, their president, who's kind of on his way out, I mean, because he's been there forever, not because they're pushing him out, he was always kind of in Larry Scott's corner for most of his time there. So I think maybe that's part of it. But if the report that SI said, if Arizona State goes to the Big 12 and they presumably make more money in the short run and probably likely in the long run, the regents would have the power to force Arizona to pay Arizona State compensation on the difference in the media contract, kind of like what's happening because the University of California regents are forcing UCLA to pay Cal, basically, as I say, Calimony, as it was nicknamed, to make up for all the money that Cal is going to be losing now that UCLA is getting paid. One of the better jokes, and is you can hear the voice in your head, and I'm going to credit Minnesota fan, get him if your loved one has been screwed over by conference realignment, you may be entitled to financial compensation. And again, Georgia fan said, like,
so true. It's so true. It's, I guess, one comment about what I think about the potential Apple deal, if it runs the way that it does, as it's reported. I could see it working. I mean, MLS is doing that right now. It certainly is a pain in the ass, though, because if you don't have Apple, or you're not willing to add yet another streaming service to probably the zillion. At this point, we're back to cable at this point with how much money we're paying for streaming services. But that's a Hail Mary sort of deal there.
Yeah.
It's either going to work out very
I
well for the Pac-12 or it is going to fail spectacularly.
I think it's dead on arrival in a lot of ways. Only because you can't really just stumble into watching a game. With streaming, you have to seek it out. And this was something that we talked about. And it's funny, even some of the other reporters around college football have been kind of basically just reposting what they wrote in February when some of these rumors were coming out, only because you can't really just stumble onto a game. You have to seek it out. And that's part of what makes, I think, especially a casual college football fan, enjoy it so much, because you can just kind of, oh, hey, what's on ESPN, what's on Fox, what's on NBC. Well, sometimes it's Notre Dame. Oh my God, who knew? But I mean, but at the same time, that kind of goes out the window. Again, the idea of just suddenly, and I apologize, I kind of got off the track here, but as the point that Mandel was making, and I agree with this, is they already tried this kind of crazy, like, oh, well, if it hits, it's going to hit big. And now they're being asked, well, here's our latest, scheme. Why don't we do a streaming service? And then if we somehow pull in X number of subscribers, we'll get some kind of financial incentive. I could see why they'd be sour to that. That's the whole reason. That entire model is what soured the entire Pac-12 to the point that they lost USC and UCLA, and now Colorado. I think a lot of folks have to remember, because I mean, you'll sometimes see on, in lots of avenues on Reddit, on Twitter or X or whatever, or, wherever, you'll get some fans that are more tech savvy saying, like, this is the future, streaming is the future. Mostly I think the average age of a cable subscriber right now is somewhere in the 60s at this point. I've heard that number bandied about. But at the same time, all of these folks who are making these decisions, they're going to be very, and again, small c conservative, traditional. They're going to be thinking, that I am responsible for this program. I have an obligation to bring in a steady stream of money, and to not even be sure you can hit some of those higher numbers. All you're told is like, okay, here's the base amount. Let's say it's 20 million, because that's roughly what's being reported, with a chance of getting into a range that might beat the Big 12. But I mean, that is high risk. It's not certain. If you're a person who works in kind of these larger sort of these kind of larger entities, you tend to be a little bit more, careful about it. And this kind of a deal is going to seem radical. I mean, I think we're all waiting to see how soon it's going to be until Arizona just says, all right, well, we heard their offer. Big 12, we know what you were getting with you. Let's move over there.
And one thing I wanted to add before we move on, because I know we have someone in the queue waiting to speak, but this reminds me a little bit of that Oklahoma Army game from a few years ago. I think it was 2019. I think we're going to eventually see instances where, well, hopefully we don't have to look at the feet of the illegal streamer for the entire game, but you're going to see people migrating en masse to watching these illegally streamed games, and that's going to kneecap the conference deal as is. The number of illegal pirators we're back in like the 1700s at this point. So, I mean, that's the huge risk, and unless they can find a way to crack down on that, I don't know how this deal is going to work out.
Yeah. So, and I want to go ahead and let's let a couple of other folks join in. Sorry about the delay. Let's hear state football. What's going on? You've been super patient.
I was just wondering if I've been hearing rumors of Clemson joining the Big Ten.
That would be, well, okay. And it's interesting because the ACC is one of the more interesting kind of conferences in all of that, because, and I know of all the reporters, I know Nicole Auerbach, she thinks that's like the most intriguing one of them all, because we've talked about it. It kind of, again, February was kind of a crazy month for a lot of this stuff. Florida State brought up the fact that they were uncomfortable with, and it came up because, again, it was their public school. It was at a public board meeting where I believe it was the athletic director presented the information on this. They said, look, we're not going to be making as much money with the ACC. Vanderbilt's now making more money than we are because they're still a member of the SEC. And I know there is a big push because the ACC, as we've talked about before, has designed a really strong grant of rights deal. That's what they call it. It's basically you can't leave early without paying a penalty. And the penalty is enormous. It's over like $100 million. And there were very strong indications that Florida State and to a lesser extent Clemson were taking Florida State was going really kind of into sort of checking internally, how can they challenge this grant of rights deal? How can they get out of the conference and maybe join the SEC or wherever? And after a few weeks, it kind of just quietly went away, which was a strong indication that, that's a problem when you have so many top schools in that conference with good lawyers. They wrote something that's really hard to get out of without spending a horde of money to leave it. So the reason I lay that groundwork is because the ACC has been the curious one, because obviously Florida State and Clemson, especially Clemson's recent success, puts it in a level where they'd be desirable to so many conferences. I mean, especially with the success on the field, they're top, they're fine public university, all of that. So mentioning that, I could see where if they were to leave, they would be attracted. There's basically like 4 teams that seem to come up whenever they say if the ACC were to break apart, what teams would be the ones that would be the most attractive? And obviously Clemson, Florida State, and then, oddly enough, North Carolina and Virginia, if you think about the fact that they're academically strong universities and they pull in some pretty populated areas that may not be covered. I always think Georgia Tech should be thrown in there only because Atlanta might be attractive to any other conference that isn't the SEC, which has it on lockdown for its own purposes. But I think if that ever comes up, and that therein lies the question, because Clemson's come up also because the other question is, let's say the Pac-12 does implode, because at this point, really, I'm not saying it's happening, but it's certainly much more feasible than it's ever been. If Arizona suddenly says we're leaving and the Pac-12 is left with 8 teams, there could be a chance they're going to say, all right, San Diego State, SMU, please join us. We know we kind of, jerked SDSU around a little bit too much because now they're stuck in a situation where they'll have to pay a much larger penalty to leave because they didn't leave by July 1st. But that might happen. But if that happens, the thought is, what would happen to the rest of the teams? Could the ACC do kind of a crazy, like, hey, would 4 of you like to become the Western wing of the ACC? It's come up in surprisingly legitimate corners of discussion as a theoretical possibility. I'm not saying it would happen, but what would happen if Oregon, Washington, Stanford, and Cal suddenly became part of the ACC and they rename it? I think Andy Staples put it best. They call themselves like the Coastal Elites Conference or something like that. But if that happens, the question is, would that also alter the grant of rights deal? And would that suddenly break the entire ACC open? Or is there another way? Will Florida State or Clemson just finally have a bunch of donors that say, like, whatever, we'll just pay all this money? Or maybe we'll figure out a way to structure it to make it work. It hasn't happened yet, but the moment the ACC starts to show weakness, I guarantee you Clemson's going to have offers thrown at it because they're just such an attractive program for multiple reasons. And I mean, if I'm the Big 12, if I'm the Big 10, they'd be more attractive than they would the SEC, because the SEC already has, a South Carolina program. I mean, if we're still going by the numbers of TV, I mean, I'm not sure there's value in entrenching, although Clemson's such a strong brand. There's the other side of it too. I mean, you could also make the same, argument that, well, the SEC already still had Texas A&M, but Texas is such a strong brand. Clemson and Florida State are strong brands. I'm not sure they would compare quite like Notre Dame would. Notre Dame is still the team where if they said they would join you, every conference seems to be able to, would absolutely say yes. It would be bonkers not to, for the amount of money that would be suddenly on the table to have them in your conference. But certainly those are the 2 in the ACC that have the most strength to them. And to an extent, Miami as well. I'm sorry, I keep always forgetting about Miami. And Miami's having its own problems. It's so funny. Before all this stuff started to go down, I thought we were going to be talking about what's going on with Miami's boosters, but apparently they've been overshadowed. So I'm sure they're happy about that. But I think it's a great question. I'm not sure at this point when it would happen and how it would happen. I think that's the biggest question. No one's sure how the ACC would come apart at this point. But and that's all I have to say about that. Sorry, that's kind of a long-winded answer.
And well, you also mentioned North Carolina and Virginia, and that would also boost basketball revenue too.
Oh, absolutely. To me, the most amazing thing is Brett Yormark, like, suddenly thinking. I mean, because I'm not saying suddenly, but he put some thought into this, because UConn has been mentioned as potentially the next team. I wonder if UConn is being kept on tap if Arizona just decides not to leave, because UConn kept coming up, and I was wondering why. I mean, their football team is kind of, it's not as dormant as it has been, but their basketball is strong. But we've talked about this before in previous cycles. Basketball isn't usually enough to make it as strong. Otherwise, Kansas would be a lot more in play than it is in a lot of these realignment talks. However, I read a good argument that said, like, if you get UConn, you've got a winning program in hoops, and you really actually do considerably start to maybe bring in New York, which at least in my mind is a better argument than the Rutgers one. The Rutgers one, which is why the Big Ten took Rutgers, was like, oh, we're going to get into the New York market. And most people were like, oh, okay. It is sort of it is sort of by New York. And you get an interesting slice of that population. But the idea of suddenly bringing in, UConn and bringing in a hoops winner in a city where you could have a game, you could have a tournament at Madison Square Garden and all that stuff, it makes some sense. And again, Brett Yormark used to be, obviously, with the Nets. He used to be the president of the Nets for many years, so he understands hoops. He understands New York City. And I could see why, in his head, that might be something. But we'll see. It could be that really what they're ultimately going to do is probably be happy to accept Arizona if it seems like they may head in that direction, given all the tea leaves that we're seeing. I wanted to go ahead, and also we have someone else who's up here too. Chase Nielsen, what's going on? You've been super patient. We're going to try to get to as many folks as we can.
Andrew Sagona, Reddit CFB. Guys, I am loving the discussion on conference realignment. Obviously, it's super exciting. We're right at the threshold of a new college football season. And while it may be stressful for some that maybe in the West Coast, the Pac-12 teams, might I remind you that the Kibby Dome reigns supreme and that the Idaho Vandals are going to take the Big Sky by storm. So let's not forget about FCS football. Let's increase viewership, and let's have a great football season.
Yeah, the funny thing is somebody wrote an article about that. I'm trying to remember which writer. I think it was, but that was one of the things. I'm trying to look for it. I have it. Yeah, Brett Sally. The Pac-12 is on the verge of collapse. Only one school can save it. Now is the time to welcome Idaho and the Kibby Dome back to FBS.
Listen, founding members.
I was about to say they were. And it was kind of funny because in those days, like this is I think when rail travel was a primary way. They used to play basically what was the predecessor of the Pac-12 played in pods, basically. So Montana and Idaho were in what was the Pac-12, but they wouldn't go down and play. I think USC and UCLA, or I don't even know if UCLA was in the Pac-12 at that point, but USC has played them in those years maybe a grand total of 3 times over 12 years. And it's because they just wouldn't really they wouldn't do the same level of conference scheduling that we do now. But yeah, no, exactly. That would be kind of a fun throwback to history. Imagine that, the Pac-12 raiding the Big Sky. That would be, it probably wouldn't happen, but I'm just saying the remnants may very well join the Mountain West with the way things are going, but we'll see where that goes. But what else is on your mind?
Hey, listen, I'm a big college football fan. It's tough seeing all this conference realignment. I kind of, it's hard to see because I live out in the West. I'm out in Utah. And, so the BYU Utah thing here, BYU's secured its spot in the Big 12. Utah is gone to the Rose Bowl 2 years in a row. And they're kind of in a, between a rock and a hard place with this Pac-12 just kind of disintegrating. And, it's tough to see because what's going to happen if they don't join the Big 12? Are we going to have a Mountain West 2.0? Like, what's really everyone's thoughts on that? I just don't see that happening long term.
It's interesting to wonder if the Pac-12 does break apart. The way we'll probably see it with these 9 remaining teams, it's going to be Arizona. It's going to jump to the Big 12. Utah and Arizona State, we'll see where that goes. My favorite comment, and again, I don't have it in front of me who wrote it, but the idea is, the car has no wheels, and now, or the border states are now a tricycle because they've lost, the Colorado unicycle has taken off. But we'll see how those 3 solve. But then the idea is, Would we see that theory where the ACC might make a reach to try and add a Western wing to it and bring in the 4 semi-strong, good, strong sports, across the board? I mean, as much as Stanford and Cal haven't necessarily been great football powers, they're usually good at other sports as well. So you're bringing in, multiple sports, but at least you'll get, theoretically a Washington or an Oregon. But that would still leave the 2 teams in every scenario that always get kind of left behind are Oregon State and Washington State. And those 2, I mean, even when we were first discussing this over a year ago with what's going to happen to the Pac-12 if it breaks apart when the announcement of USC and UCLA departing came out, I mean, it seems like they would be the 2 that would kind of have to just sort of find a home wherever. And it's sadly, maybe that would be it. Maybe they would be the ones that would end up in the Mountain West. But that's jumping too far ahead, I think, at this point. But at least in all the scenarios, it's not clear where they would go. That's kind of the bottom line with those guys. I want to bring in at least a couple more people. Looks like Ronnie J. Oh, hey, yeah. What's up? Yeah, boy, Ron. What's been going on, man?
What's up? I just wanted to talk about UConn for a second because, man, I don't fully understand UConn to the Big 12 as much as I do them going to the Big 10 or ACC. In fact, I don't even know why the ACC isn't doing anything. You feel like at some point, like, you ever see that meme where the guy's poking the thing with the stick? It's like, come on, do something.
I agree. I think now the ACC is just trying to hold together because when Florida State made it sound like they were seriously looking at leaving, and then they apparently did the numbers and found out it's a crippling amount of money to pay out if they were to leave. It's like 9 figures. I think at this point the ACC is just waiting to see, and I've joked about this since last summer, the knife fight between the Big 12 and the Pac-12. Although now we seem to have a good indication of what's happening in the results there. I think they're waiting to see how that resolves itself, and then maybe they'll make a move. But at this point, that's why the best thing. I mean, the only scenario that I thought was plausible was maybe they start to poach some of the best remaining schools from the Pac-12 as kind of a Western division. But it seems like a stretch to even say that aloud. But yeah, with UConn again, I get it. But the more I thought about Brett Yormark's background and all of this, the more it made sense. And again, I could see them as just sort of who they were talking about while they were waiting to see what happened to Arizona. Because let's say they clearly didn't entirely know what I think they were confident the Pac-12 wasn't going to get a good deal compared to their own deal. But at the same time, they're not going to say anything and get egg on their face. So I think maybe UConn was the program they were kind of lightly discussing to see if Arizona finally does defect. But it could be maybe they're hungrier than that. Maybe they do add UConn. Maybe they add the Four Corner schools. Who knows how big the Big 12 could get? Maybe they'll go to 16. Because
well, I mean, aren't they limited by ESPN? So, like, at the end of the day, after they take Arizona, they only can add 2 more teams, I thought.
Yeah, and perhaps that's exactly it. Perhaps that's exactly what we'll see. I see someone else wants to jump in really quick.
Fox can approve a pro rata.
I'm sorry, I cut you off. Could you say that again?
Yeah, so Fox is the one that limits the contract. So ESPN,
my bad.
Fox can allow for what's called a pro rata, and so they would have to pay. I think they're on the hook for $11 million if they want to extend beyond 14 teams. And I just want to hop in for a sec on UConn. You're absolutely right on Yormark's vision and his background being part of it, but it's also part of the draw is you are capturing some New York City and Boston markets, and maybe not in its entirety, but you are capturing a sizable amount. There's a huge alumni population there.
I mean, are you though? Like Boston, I lived in Boston for 2 years. No one cares about. I'm going to be honest. No one cares about UConn and Boston. And New York City, sure, a little bit, but New York City, even then, outside of the Big East tournament, I don't feel like really. And I lived in New York and New Jersey for 20 years. Doesn't really care about college sports.
It doesn't, but I would argue that it's the same reasoning you would take a Rutgers in the sense that, like, you're not going to get the whole market, but you're talking about a population that outnumbers multiple states put together. I mean, when we were talking about USC and UCLA, Los Angeles' metro population is bigger than Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama combined. So I mean, and New York is
Exactly.
bigger than that. So while you're getting like a slice of it, that slice suddenly sounds like the state of Mississippi in terms of population. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
But do
And
you
the
think? Do you
difference,
think
oh,
like? Oh, go on. Go on.
the difference is Rutgers is a large state school. UConn has a lot of money being poured into it currently. And while their athletic department is in hot water over financial spending, like I said, their donors are plentiful and they're ready. And I could see them making the jump. And I've gotten a lot of crap on Big 12 Twitter for this, but I see them making the jump in recruiting extensively if they were to wind up in a Power Five conference. And also, from a big picture lens, once you say to East Coast institutions, hey, I'm open for business, you also can attract leftover, hypothetically, if Clemson and Florida State find a way to break the ironclad contract that a nice lawyer wrote on retainer, you're looking at the Big 12 potentially being able in a position with substantial leverage to bring in Eastern Coast institutions in the ACC
I
because
think they
you
could.
have
I think
that
they could, but I'm not sure
presence.
they would be able to get into the bidding war for Clemson and Florida State, or even necessarily.
No,
But I
no,
mean,
no,
don't get me
no.
wrong. There would still be
That
some
yeah,
very attractive teams there. I mean, the entire ACC has some solid programs there. I mean, the ones again
for
you kind
sure.
of think, okay, well, Wake Forest, we'll see where you land, but the rest of them,
Yeah, I wasn't saying Clemson and Florida State. I'm working off the assumption that Big Ten is going to poach them, which I believe is true. So you're looking at a lot of still valuable institutions that you could potentially poach.
yeah,
I feel like just where all the conferences are at now, for the purposes of UConn, the Big Ten would probably make more sense than anything else. You're already there, and I don't see why the Big Ten would say no to UConn in the
I think
long
I don't
term.
know if their numbers necessarily crunched right for them. I think that would be the one thing. They already have Rutgers. I don't know how they feel about that in the long term, but I could see at this point the Big Ten really just waiting for grand slams at this point, because that's why I think they were so tepid about the idea, despite the strong interest from the programs, Oregon and Washington. Because to me, UConn and Washington are I would say Washington and Oregon might be stronger programs than UConn overall in terms of what they offer, and they still, the Big Ten kind of was like, I think it would take a team.
I mean, does Washington bring in more money than UConn?
I'm not, it's a stronger football program, and I mean, again, we still tend to look at it that way when we look at some of these numbers. I think that's what made UConn such an interesting idea, is that suddenly putting basketball into a zone where you might be able to pull in New York City, where is basketball hot, and suddenly you could get that. And again, you have a commissioner who was so plugged into basketball for so long. But it is different. I want to give them more opportunities to talk, only because we have so many people who've wanted to join. TriStar, what's going on?
Oh, what's going on, gentlemen? How are we doing tonight?
Good. How are you?
So from what I'm gathering, I just got in here. I was fueling up my truck. I'm a truck driver, but I also cover Tennessee athletics. And one thing that's been on my mind is all this realignment stuff. And of course, me, I grew up in the '90s and 2000s, and I'm a sucker for how the conferences used to be because they weren't too big, and you had more. I feel like you had more teams and more representation, whereas now you don't have nearly as many, and the conferences are getting, in my opinion, too big to where, like, for example, look at Nebraska. Nebraska for decades was a powerhouse. Numerous conference championships, numerous national championships, numerous All Americans, you know, great fan base, tons of money and all that stuff. But then they go to the Big Ten. Yes, they're getting more money, but I feel like they've been worse off in terms of the program. They've not been nearly as successful. And I mean, you can say the same thing with Colorado. I remember as a kid that Colorado
Oh
Nebraska
yeah.
game at the end of the season, that was a huge game. Now, I wanted to share this in here if you don't mind. I want to share this into the Jumbotron and I want to get y'all's opinion on this. I made my own little conference realignment thing and a playoff idea. I was thinking because, there's been all this talk, and I'm a huge sucker, like Josh Pate is, for regionality and rivalries. So as you see, I made 8 conferences, all with 10 teams, except the SEC's got 12. And the playoff is an 8-team playoff with the 8 conference champions, and so that way there's no complaining about how that team should have gotten over that team, and no conference gets left out, and all conferences have great football teams in them. I just want to get y'all's opinion on that. Y'all can look it over. If you click on that tweet, you can see I've got tweets under that main tweet showing who's in what conference and all that stuff.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I see it. And thanks for sharing that. These kinds of, I think this is what I think folks would prefer. If you ask 9 out of 10 fans, I think they would prefer to have, going back to sort of geographically sensible conferences, the way you've drawn them up here. Unfortunately, we've seen that go out the window to some extent. And I want to circle back real quick because you brought up an interesting point that got me thinking, because you were talking about Nebraska and Colorado in their heydays. I think Nebraska's biggest change was just bad coaching hires. I think we can say that, because let's say Nebraska had hired Nick Saban. I think we would have seen Nebraska suddenly become terrifying again.
Well, that's subjective, because if you remember when he got hired at LSU, he was coming off his stint at Michigan State, and
right.
He wasn't the GOAT at Michigan State by no stretch.
No. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what I was kind of just leaning on. I'm like, well, if he had, if you brought, and I'm not necessarily Nick Saban, but, Bo Pelini was all right, but they had a couple like Bill Callahan was a disaster. It just didn't fit.
And I thought
Mike
Scott
Riley
Frost
still
was going to
doesn't
work.
make sense.
Am I the only one that thought Scott Frost would work? Because
I think everyone thought they were going to work.
The hometown boy, played there. He's from Lincoln. Like, they're like, he gets it. He's from here. He marinated in it as a kid. Like, he gets it.
And, yeah, absolutely. That was,
And if you look in that, like I said, I've got 8 conferences. All of them except the SEC have 10 teams. Somebody asked me, where's the Arizona schools? Well, I've actually got them in the Mountain West. And the Mountain West, I put that as kind of the 4 corner states, like Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and I put Wyoming in there because they're basically on the border and they got history with all those other teams. And if you look at my SEC, I took out Kentucky, but I also put in Georgia Tech, Tulane, and Florida State. So now you got 2 teams per each southern state. I made the ACC basically the traditional ACC, the Carolinas and Virginia. I brought back the Big East, and I put UCF in there with Miami, and I put Penn State in that. And the Big Ten, I put Kentucky, Louisville, and Cincinnati in the Big Ten. Tell me that would not be a fun conference.
It would be. Unfortunately, and then that's the sad thing, is this looking at that kind of an idea, it makes us long for those times when those sort of conferences were possible.
Like, for example, like a lot of people told me their favorite one was the Southwest Conference, because you got like all the major Texas schools. I threw UTSA in there because it used to be Rice, but Rice is no longer really that good. And UTSA has been really good. And I was like, well, basically I'll just swap out Rice for UTSA. It's all the original Southwest Conference schools. Plus, you get Oklahoma and Oklahoma State in there because they're not really that far away from Arkansas and all that stuff. And there's a lot of Arkansas fans in Tulsa. So you got a lot of interaction with the fans. And people might look at me and say, well, you put Florida State in there, why not Miami? Well, for one, in the SEC bylaws, you can only have 2 teams per state. So this talk of adding Florida State and Miami into the SEC, they're not adding 2, they're adding 1 because they've already got Florida. They can't have 3.
Yeah,
and that's from
I would say though,
bylaws.
if the money's there though, bylaws do get changed really quick. I want to allow a couple of other folks who've been up, had a chance to join in. Let's hear. Quinshawn is him. I know you've been really patient. Then I'll head over to you, UCF.
Hey guys,
how are you doing?
How are you doing? I was gonna wonder, since y'all talking about UConn, I was wondering about basketball schools. Do you think Gonzaga could move to the power conference just for basketball?
That's a good question. Just for basketball, I'm not sure. A lot of the programs, especially at the very top, They want full sports. They want as many of the sports to be played as possible. And football is such a moneymaker and is so pivotal to a lot of these contracts. So the Mountain West seems to be the closest that has considered having them join, just like Wichita State and other really strong kind of hoops schools. But I would be shocked if we get to a point where, including a Pac-12, any of the P5 would be willing to necessarily do a sport like that. Sometimes you get quirky ones, like they might be like there was a brief period of time where like Cal State Bakersfield was technically in the Pac-12 for one sport because they had a wrestling program at the time, and there just weren't that many in the Pac-12. So sometimes you'll get oddballs like that. The basketball is a pretty dramatic one, and without football, I could see that being an issue there. But it's an interesting question, though. I'm not saying it's a bad question. I think it's an interesting one.
I just don't know how UConn would compete in the Big Ten as football.
How well they do, we'll see. Sometimes, Mora can coach fairly well. At UCLA, he had some pretty decent seasons before he kind of petered out and they let him go. But yeah, I don't know. They wouldn't necessarily be a team I would expect to challenge all the time, but they've had their heights. I still remember when they were in the Orange Bowl. They made one New Year's Six bowl, and that was a wild season for them. So it's possible. But they wouldn't be. They would be like they would be a middle of the pack team in terms of football, in the sense that you'd occasionally be hoping for that one really good season, but they wouldn't. I don't think anyone would ever envision them being a program that would be, a perennial championship contender or anything like that. Let's see here. I want to get, again, we're kind of moving around as many of you all as we can. UCF is land. What's going on?
How's it going? Good. UCF.
Oh, I totally misread that. Yeah.
No, you're good. You're good. Yeah, I had two quick comments. It was actually based on somebody mentioned the UConn conversation earlier, and then Scott Frost. I actually worked on his staff back when I was an equipment guy. I was a little iffy when he moved to Nebraska, to be honest, just because of the type of coach he was. Obviously, you're on the equipment staff, so you're not working directly with him, but I saw the type of person he was. I think UCF worked out really well for him just because that was kind of his personality. And I feel like the pressure cooker of Nebraska kind of got to him a little too much, and he wasn't quite ready for that. He's more of like an analyst, offensive coordinator type of person, not really a head coach type of guy. So he's not very vocal. At that time when I was there, it was player-led. So a lot of the players were taking over the leadership, and we had great leaders like Mackenzie Milton and Shaquem Griffin.
Absolutely.
So you can tell he kind of put it in the hands of the players. And because they had such a group of guys, they were kind of leading from the front rather than Scott Frost. And Frost would just run the offensive play calling and stuff. But there were times where he would come in late. There was times where he wasn't as disciplined as you would think as a head coach. And I think that kind of trickled into Nebraska, and people started seeing that a little bit. But when it comes to UConn, we've played them several times,
civil
right?
Conflict.
They actually have
the civil conflict,
right? They actually have the resources for it, and UConn kind of operates, I think, still to this day, as if back in the Big East time period, as if they actually had that that mentality of like a power program. I think they really just got left behind. And if you look at the revenue numbers and some of the statistics, it actually shows that they're pretty on par with some of those bottom kind of scraping Power 5 programs like Rutgers and stuff. I believe they were only like $2 million off last year revenue-wise from Rutgers, and I think they beat out certain programs like even Houston. And so they have actually the revenue. Like you said, they have big-time donors that really do, if you look at their facilities, they are actually on par with some of these ACC lower tier programs, some of these Big 12 programs. So they really are kind of ready for it. But like you said, whether they actually fit into the Big 12 or not, that's really another question. But yeah, that was just my quick comments I want to make.
I appreciate it. Yeah, and I agree. UConn has the ability to at least get into a level where they could be in that Big 12 mix and not be completely short of it. And then getting a bigger influx of money. Their whole idea of going independent, I think, in the long run wasn't a great one. So I think, but they were at a point where they thought they could potentially join a bigger conference, and the invite never came. But at this point, I think they still have the ability to at least jump onto one of those and do pretty fine. I want to give an opportunity here to Idaho Vandals fan club. What's going on?
What's up? What's up? Obviously, I come from bias,
Looks
right?
like you unmuted, but I can't hear you.
I can hear him.
Oh, is it my end? All right, I'm
All
going to
right,
reset.
word.
Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Obviously, I come from bias. You asked me, I think at worst, Idaho's going 10-2 this season. Losses to maybe not Nebraska, Nevada, and Cal. But I want to see from an outside perspective y'all's realistic thoughts on Idaho. I think an FCS championship is in the sights easily, but that's just my opinion.
I'm going to look up the schedule right now, see what you guys have.
I would be shocked if we beat Cal, but it would also be the greatest day of my life personally.
All right, I'm back, and I heard the end of that. So which Cal? So I just heard defeating Cal. Which program are we talking about? Sorry about that.
Idaho.
Ooh. Well,
Okay, so their 2023 schedule is as follows. They're at Lamar, at Nevada, at Cal, versus Sacramento State, at Eastern Washington, at Cal Poly, versus Montana State, at Northern Colorado, at Weber State, and home against Idaho State to wrap the season.
Well, I'm going to be honest. I could see Cal losing their first 3 games because they've got kind of a weird one, and it's not one that I think people would expect because they open at North Texas. North Texas, granted, new coach, but it's going to be a home game for them. It's going to be hot as hell in Texas, way hotter than at Cal, and I could see that upset. That actually came up, I want to say, last week on the show. We've kind of talked about some of the strengths that North Texas has as a program, and this could be one. And then they host Auburn, which at this point, Auburn's actually, I'm not sure if they're going to be like as strong as they could be, but as much as all the controversy around hiring Coach Freeze, all the indications seem to be Auburn's coming back alive because their recruiting looks just absolutely tremendous again, and that was again one of those huge factors that led to the coaching change that they had in the offseason. So again, Auburn, I even though it's at Cal, I would strongly favor them as well. Idaho would be, I mean, it's a little bit riskier. I don't know.
I know it's a press.
It is, but it isn't. Wouldn't be as shocking as say Washington. You know what I mean? Then people would be like, "Wow, how did that?" And I mean, again, that's what's the beauty of our sport, right? These things happen. But I'm not sure. Idaho could do it, but that would be the tougher of the 3. But of course, if they're really worn down after those first 2 games, who knows what kind of Cal team you have there?
Yeah, my question to the other guy is realistic outside perspective on Idaho's ceiling this season. No offense, your name's Andrew. I'm sorry about that. I disrespected
That's all
you.
right. I've been called a lot of things. Other guy is probably the nicest. So let me check. I'll be upfront. I'm not as versed in FCS as I am in FBS, but I mean, Montana State's going to be tough. They're constantly making it far in the playoffs. Luckily for you guys, the FBS. I'm not sure if FBS counts against you in terms of record, but I'll bounce off of what Bobak said that Cal could be at risk. Same with Nevada.
I mean, Idaho's always had the situation of being, especially ever since they moved back into the Big Sky. That is a tough conference. I haven't, Sac State should theoretically be weaker now. I think there's so much you can say about the success they had, but of course they lost.
Definitely.
Yeah, but of course that head coach, how much of it was Troy Taylor? I think it was a lot on Troy Taylor, and Stanford's obviously got him now. So, by the way, I'm really looking forward to watching that Sacramento State at Stanford game. That's going to be a delight. It's actually the same time Idaho is playing at Cal. So maybe wow. No, I mean, I just realized that they're both on the 16th. Wouldn't that be a delight if we suddenly got a pair of FCS upsets in the Bay Area? But that might be a tall order. Although I still remember Stanford has one of the most embarrassing FCS upsets of any program, because UC Davis wasn't upset them at Stanford. But the thing was, UC Davis had only just begun the transition from D2 to FCS. So it wasn't like they were what we have now with the Hawk Love with Dan Hawkins over there. This was like, oh, we're just starting as an FCS program. Stanford invites them over and Stanford loses. It was so embarrassing that the head coach at the time, Walt Harris, wrote a letter to everybody in the alumni saying, like, I'm really sorry, we really let everyone down. So, that's your goal, Idaho. You have to get Cal. You have to get that kind of, there's two levels of that. Can you get them to fire their head coach? I don't know. I think at this point, Justin Wilcox, I'm not sure how much room that Cal's going to give him, but I mean, he's still there. But can you get Justin Wilcox to be so embarrassed he has to write a letter to everybody from the Cal alumni saying, like, I let you all down? That's the goal. There you go.
Hell yeah, brother. Thank you.
I will say two things. Two things. One, I think the power of the Kibbie Dome will look down upon you fondly this season. I feel like the Kibbie Dome has some kind of supernatural powers.
That's why they made us only play there 4 times this season.
Oh,
exactly.
That's brutal.
And then
wow.
And then second, I wanted to say, Bobak, this is kind of off topic, but people have been suggesting that RCFB should try to buy a bowl sponsorship.
Yeah, that's come up over
Honestly,
the years.
we should try to buy the field sponsorship to the Kibbie.
Yeah, if we had the money, yeah.
Forget about bowls.
With all $0 of revenue that we have, that would be a fun one. Maybe they'll take.
I can chip in like 20.
Oh, sweet. All right. Well, there you go. If you keep doing that. Let's see here. I want to allow. What's up, Hayden Ross, Creekwater? What's going on?
What's up, guys? I'm going to try to be quick. I got a couple things I want to say. The first one, TriStar's little conference realignment map. You can tell it's made by a trucker. It looks like a list of like Love's truck stops across America with little dots on it. But side note, but when it comes to like the Big Ten and the ACC, like I think the Big Ten and the SEC do not want to add any more teams than what they're at right now at 16. Like they haven't, at least for a few years, there's never been a conference even with 16 teams. I think both commissioners came out and said they want to see how it works with 16 teams before you add 18, because it's a big jump to go from 14 to 18 without trying the 16 first. So I think there's going to be a few years for Oregon and Washington where they're going to have to make a decision on what they're wanting to do, because I don't think the Big Ten's going to add them at least for 4 or 5 years or so. And then when it comes to like UConn in the Big 12, UConn they've had some decent years in football before. I think they made a Orange Bowl, or they made a Fiesta Bowl, or I think they beat Oklahoma in the Fiesta Bowl a while back, or played them, and so they have some potential in football. And if you can add like the Big 12 add like an Arizona and a UConn, I know it's all football that makes the money, but your mark is really focuses on basketball as well, even though it doesn't make as much. But if you can go to the networks with the TV deal and you can say that you have UConn basketball, Arizona basketball, Kansas basketball, plus a lot of other solid programs, I mean, I think that can kind of move the needle a little bit more than most basketball conferences have. Like, because I think the Big 12 solidified itself as like the third conference in terms of TV viewership and TV ratings. So and it's not going to pass the Big 10 or SEC, no matter what in that. So if they can come in and say we're the third most viewed football conference and the most viewed basketball conference, I feel like that's where UConn could add some value, especially if Arizona comes with them.
That's a good point about how the Arizona Hoops team would also, complement them. Just really super minor thing, because I don't want Oklahoma fans to be like, what? Oklahoma actually clobbered UConn pretty badly in that Fiesta Bowl. But the fact is, as you're right, they made the Fiesta Bowl. I don't want to take away at that at all, because and that was kind of what we were going back to earlier with an earlier caller. UConn has decent enough facilities to probably jump into the Big 12 and not like they wouldn't be again a perennial football contender, but they could compete. But I think certainly you're right. I mean, I think with Mark coming from the Nets, and then having such a dynamic kind of I was impressed by him when he was hired, but I was kind of holding back because, you can be impressed by somebody who's not from the college football world, and then you end up with Larry Scott. Or then, at this point, unfortunately, George Kliavkoff's kind of looking that way as well. But
Yeah.
going back to what's going on here, I think the idea of making basketball so attractive and being able to have those teams, let's say Madison Square Garden, you may not dominate the New York market. I mean, I don't think any college program ever could, but you're going to get a nice enough chunk of one of the most populated places on earth, which has a lot to say there. Andrew, I know you wanted to kind of add something in really quick.
Yeah, I just recalled that a couple of seasons ago, UConn redid its football. Sorry, I'm thinking football, soccer. It's the World Cup going on right now. It's football locker room, and I mean that shows a bit of a interest in them trying to make some movement toward improving their program.
They hired a great coach as well.
Yeah, I think that. Well, it was
That
funny
too.
because Mora, they were a little bit. People were wondering, like, well, is he going to be good or not? And he ends up being pretty solid. So I think it's going to be curious to see how if it continues. But certainly
right
making
now,
a bowl was a nice change of pace for UConn.
Yeah, and right now I think I've read, I think it's Fox is paying UConn like $3.5 or so million for their football rights because they're an independent. I mean, if they can hop into the Big 12, that'll give them significantly, more money to invest back into the football program. And their basketball program has been the most successful program since '99. I think they have 4 national titles or 3 national titles, something like that. But last thing I'll say, I think when it comes to Oregon and Washington and the Big Ten and all that, I think that the Big Ten, like I said, is going to wait it out and see how it looks with 16 teams. And also, I think that they're waiting for the ACC to fall apart. Like, I know they have to wait till their TV deal's up before they can move, but I think if they get a certain amount of schools to agree to, to disband, it can, end. But like Clemson, Florida State, North Carolina, and probably Miami are all going to end up in the SEC or the Big Ten. And then like the Big 12 could come in and add a school like Louisville, Pitt, Virginia Tech. I think we're headed to like 3 big conferences, and I think it's going to be the Big 10, the SEC, and the Big 12. And that's just my opinion. But the Big 10 is going to make Notre Dame tell them no, which they probably will. But I think a bunch of dominoes are going to start falling in terms of Oregon and all of them until the ACC falls apart or like disbands. I think that's when really we're going to start seeing stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be the big question. What the ACC does. They're the most intriguing mystery in all of this. After the Florida State kind of voiced their displeasure with the conference in an internal, well, not internal, it was public, but I mean, with a meeting with their own board of, I always forget if it's regents or trustees from school to school. But when they did that back in February, suddenly we knew the ACC did have some discontent. It seems like when they realized how hard it was to break that contract, because apparently it's like $100 and something million for any team to leave at this point. Yeah. They're now just going to try and, I believe, come up with a way to give Clemson and FSU a little bit more of the pie. It still won't match the individual payouts that SEC or Big Ten teams would get. But yeah, if one of these conferences does start to come apart, it will be curious. I think that's an interesting idea. Would we end up with 3 big conferences? At this point, though, it seems like the Big Ten and SEC would still be on the best end of that in terms of the money coming in. Because right now, I think that it's fun to try and imagine what we call things now, because that's come up a few times. Is it now the top 2, the middle 3, and then the others? I'm not sure that's not a very complimentary way of saying it. But at this point with the Pac-12, I mean, who knows? Is it going to be the top 2, the middle 2, and then, the potpourri of random teams that kind of have been spread out everywhere else?
Because the ACC the smaller schools in the ACC, like the Wakes and the, all that, like they're happy with it. But the, Clemson and the Florida States and the Miamis and North Carolinas, they kind of screwed themselves signing that long of a deal. And they also make less than the current Big 12 makes in terms of like individual TV payouts right now. And Duke, that's one that no one's really talking about. Like I have a hard time seeing Duke not kind of make it to like maybe the Big Ten or something, just because their name brand in basketball is one of the two, maybe one school in the country that can like carry itself into a Power 5 conference just with basketball.
The problem, their biggest problem for Duke is UNC is right by them, and I think that's always been their. UNC, you get more of a full complement of all sports, and like their academic fit would be. That's why they always tend to come up, because if the ACC were to break apart, oddly enough, Virginia, it also gets pulled into that because you have two public academic universities with Virginia and UNC, and suddenly they might be a better fit for, like, let's say, a Big Ten. I'm always surprised Georgia Tech doesn't come up as much, only because of Atlanta. And while that wouldn't necessarily be attractive to the SEC, which has it on lockdown, I think that would be the question: who would want them more? And I think if the Big Ten wanted them, that would be an interesting pull for them to suddenly pull themselves into the South. But that's a huge hypothetical. I don't want to get too far ahead on that.
Do you think that if it all starts, happening or whatever, do you think Duke, if the Big 12 called, would be considerate if they added like an Arizona and a UConn already, and then you could have they would want to be a part of the best basketball conference in the country?
Well,
or do you think that their academics kind of wouldn't be into it?
If ACC came apart, Duke would certainly be trying to figure. I mean, I think all the teams would be like, well, can I get into the SEC or Big Ten? If you can, you're going to go there. But if not, yeah, I could see the Big 12 being the one to sweep them up, because what's the alternative going to be at that point? I mean, we're going to assume that if things start to really fall apart, the Pac-12 is probably not going to be able to make a competitive offer at this rate, because we've been talking about it. The Pac-12, just to kind of reiterate, it sounds like basically what we're getting out of I wouldn't say rumors, but what's coming out of these meetings hasn't been exactly fully reported. So I guess it is somewhat of a rumor. It's about $20 million per school, with the idea that they'd be on Apple TV, and Apple TV would give them bonuses if they were able to somehow drive an enormous amount of subscriptions their way. That's a huge if.
They also are saying that it's hard to budget. Like, if you don't know how much money you're going to get, it's hard to budget. And yeah, and it's a similar thing. Apple's trying to do the same thing that they did with MLS. Like, if you have Apple TV, you won't just get the Pac-12 games. You'll have to go out of your way to buy them, separately. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. It's kind of a fascinating time. This has been the most fascinating in terms of conference realignment that we've had. Like, normally, you hear a lot of stuff and not much happens, or maybe like OU and Texas, they leave in the middle of the night out of nowhere. But this year, it seems like there's a lot of talk and there's stuff actually happening. And I think that has a lot to do with the Pac-12 and Big 12 TV deals ending at the exact same time.
Absolutely. I think that we're finally getting what we were all waiting for since USC and UCLA left. But really, it just kept prolonging, mostly because, again, we'll have a TV deal. Oh, we don't have a TV deal, that the Pac-12 has been doing for so long that it's I think sowed a lot of bitterness in a lot of potential teams that might have been interested in them, or at least some of their own members. I want to allow the Street Cynic. You've been really patient. What's going on?
Hey guys, thanks for having me. I just had a question. It's like my question is, how much do you think potential upside matters in these conference realignment talks? And I don't mean financial upside with media deals, like with those escalators or anything like that. I mean like the potential upside of teams themselves. Because like in my mind right now, like the example that stands out in my mind is just those two Bay Area schools out there, Cal and Stanford. It's like, I get that both of them are down right now. But, in not too distant history, both of them have been good. And when they were good, they were really good. I think like Cal was like a hair's breadth away from being the number one ranked team in the nation. Stanford had, a bunch of Rose Bowls. And so, is there upside there? Because, people seem to be looking at the teams as they are right now. But that San Francisco Bay Area market, that's still going to be a valuable market, with all its like, tech billionaires, and there's still a lot of people there and all that stuff. It's like, is there some kind of a world where Cal and Stanford take like half share and get into something like the Big Ten because the Big Ten wants to buy low and sell high? Maybe they get some concessions from Cal and Stanford to invest more in their revenue sports or what have you. Like, I have to imagine that there is upside there to be unlocked. And does that thinking get factored in with these conference realignment talks? That's just my question.
No, and you bring up something interesting here, because I remember when they were, as soon as USC and UCLA bolted, there was kind of a question of, well, what's the value of the teams left? And the assumption was Oregon and Washington were the next two big teams. And then they were talking to, as a lot of reporters are kind of contacting the people that seem to have the most knowledge. And usually those were former TV executives, like people who had been network heads and retired network presidents in sports. And Stanford would come up a little bit more as like, Stanford is still a valuable brand. It's in the Bay Area. They've had a little more recent consistency in terms of success on the field. Cal was number 2 in that crazy 2007 season. So it's almost like that whole season was weird, because USF, South Florida, was second at one point in that year. So that was a wacky one. So we'll just table that particular season for a short moment. Cal's other big problem, I should say, is the amount of debt they carry, because when they did some wildly optimistic changes to the program when they were upgrading facilities. When they had to upgrade California Memorial Stadium, which is built across a fault line, and I don't know if they knew it at the time they did it, because it's quite an old stadium, needed to have a really major overhaul. So when they did that major overhaul, they borrowed heavily and had a really, again, optimistic assumption that they were going to somehow bring Cal football to the level of, USC or, some of the SEC programs in terms of seat subscriptions, seat licenses, I should say, and sales. And obviously Cal did not deliver on that side. So they've been for a while carrying an enormous debt load, to the point where the university had to bail out their athletic department. So asking them to suddenly step up might not be as plausible. While Stanford has some alumni who are willing to throw money, they're a little more hesitant, but I could see Stanford being a part of that. So I think that's why when they were saying which Bay Area school would be picked, Stanford tends to come up a little bit more, just because they're a little more flexible. They have some alumni there that are willing to throw. I remember, gosh, Stanford, because being where they are, they have just insane property prices, and they have for a long time. So if you're an assistant coach, where do you live? That was always kind of the question. As it turns out, they had a very wealthy alum who basically built a townhouse community for basically the assistant coaches to live in, so they would be able to afford to live near Stanford. So that's the kind of money that exists at that school. So yeah, they could throw a lot of money and get into the mix. Of course, the flip side of that is the academics. And that's always been one of their kind of trickier factors, and how you can make that work and still be competitive. It seemed for a while there that they had it going, and then things slowly started to kind of fade there, and they finally let go, after, I wouldn't say it was a surprise, but when they let go of David Shaw, that was kind of a moment of what was working all those years. It started under Harbaugh and kind of continued under Shaw, just kind of stopped ceasing the work for them. So I'm not could they join in one of these conferences? They would be attractive and they would pull in a market, but I think at this point, there's certainly not a school that would be as worried as, say, Washington State and Oregon State. I think the two Bay Area schools and Washington and Oregon are the 4 that seem to have the most ability to then jump to another conference. But where they would fit is a whole other question. Again, one of the more interesting ones I've heard, and this was from Nicole Auerbach, so it's not like from some totally random account, was a theory, and it's not just her. I've heard it from a couple of different places. Is the ACC theoretically then looking to add an entirely new Western part of their conference and add those 4 schools, and maybe who knows who else they could grab if the Big 12 doesn't grab the rest. But I'm going to wait to see how that pans out, because we've heard of even more plausible scenarios over all the decades of conference realignment that didn't pan out. It's amazing to think that at one point, the Pac-10, I think it just became the Pac-12, was almost ready to add Texas and Oklahoma, and then just they weren't able to come to an agreement on what to do with the Longhorn Network, so it didn't happen. And imagine if that had happened. Imagine what would have happened if suddenly the Pac-12 had added those 2. And at one point, they were even talking about, they pull in a few more teams, like an Oklahoma State or a Texas Tech or something like that. And clearly, that didn't work out. So let's see here. Bandit, do you want to go ahead and unmute really quick?
Yeah, I'm a little. I just got on. I didn't know if you guys talked about Washington, Oregon's landing spot. There's no way I can see them signing any grant of rights with the current Pac-12 offer. And when do you think they might make a move, or where they're going to land?
I think that's a great question, and everyone's looking at Arizona right now only because they've been the noisiest in terms of like we're considering the Big 12, and we'll first see what the offer is. But ever since the USC and UCLA departure was announced, everyone looked at Oregon and Washington and where they would land. So I think would the Big 12 be willing to go that wild and pull in as many teams as they could from the Pac-12? That would remain to be seen. At this point, we're almost in a weird zone of sports. Sometimes nicknamed the Tyson zone from the wackiest times of Mike Tyson, of where almost any potential happening seems plausible. But one of the more interesting theories that's been touted by some folks that I wouldn't necessarily say are likely to put out, really just crazy ideas, is that they might even feasibly, would the ACC decide to jump into things and try and start some really far West Coast teams, become a bi-coastal conference. If you get enough teams, it's plausible for the Olympic sports to keep them from having to travel as much as, say, USC and UCLA suddenly will have to be doing. But it's not clear where they would go. One of the other things I heard that I thought was interesting too, with Oregon and Washington, do they want to move conferences and only to have, because they're clearly desire to be in the Big Ten. I think that seems, or the SEC, but I mean, realistically, I think the Big Ten seems to be the one that they foresee the most likely. They would have to pay exit fee from whatever conference they were in. Would they be willing to go move to a medium, a sort of a second step conference, and then have to pay a different, like they'd pay an exit fee from the Pac-12 to, let's say, go to the Big 12 or the ACC or wherever? Would they then want to have to pay it again to go if the Big 10 suddenly opened up? I've heard that thrown out there. I could see both ways. I could see them being willing to do that just to improve, again, the short term, because, again, you're trying to, if you're the athletic director and the president of the university, you're trying to make sure you get the most for your institution. I think there's nothing wrong with that kind of a selfish thought, because that's why they paid you. That's why you're hired. You're responsible for that institution. But no, I think it's interesting, and I think you've definitely pointed out, like, what about those two? They were the biggest question a year ago, and now we're kind of, with Arizona's kind of circus right now, everyone's kind of busy looking at what's going on, in Tucson.
I have a hard time thinking that they're going to leave USC and UCLA on an island on the West Coast just because of the traveling and stuff. Stanford's a great fit for the Big Ten, just, academic wise and the fit. And I think that it would help to get Notre Dame in there also. But this whole Florida State stuff sort of threw a little bit of a loop in the whole thing. But I think eventually the SEC and the Big Ten are going to get to 24. What 24 teams? I don't know. I see like a Oregon, Washington, Stanford, UCLA, and USC, and Nebraska and closer to that region being a pod, having a three team pod of 8 teams. But I think with this whole ACC stuff going on, until we find out exactly what FSU's planning on doing, I think Oregon and Washington are in a limbo. And honestly, if they had to go to the Big 12 and pay an exit fee, I would be happy with that. But there's no way that the Pac 10, 12, 8, 9, whatever you want to call it now, is sustainable with the Apple TV money. It's just not there. And I just don't see anybody signing off on that, except for maybe Oregon State and Washington State. They're probably the ones out there happy with the numbers right now.
Yeah, because they have no choice. They're the ones that get left out in every scenario, and you got to feel for them. It reminds me of when the first time the Big 12 looked like it would fall apart, not after Texas and OU left, but after, it looked like it might break apart when actually that same scenario where the Pac-12 nearly lured Texas and Oklahoma. there were a couple of teams that in every scenario just kind of got left out. And it was always like Iowa State, Kansas State, where would they end up going? And now, of course, in the long run, now they're at least in a more stable conference, as it turned out. And who knew it had to do with leadership, and having someone. And that's, again, both conferences went outside of the box. Kliavkov was from the entertainment world. They got him from MGM Resorts. And, Kliav, probably Yormark was from the New Jersey Nets, and he had a history in the NBA. And, sometimes you just sort of see how that pans out. Let's see here. I want to allow at least one more person come in as we slowly start wrapping this up. Tyler, what's going on?
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
So my question is kind of in regards to Duke. There are Duke football fans out there. I'm one of, I think, 20 of us. But when it comes to Duke, I think they're one of the more interesting groups or schools with the whole ACC when it inevitably falls apart, in the sense of, where do you think they go? Because I put them kind of like UConn, in the sense they're not by any means a football powerhouse, but in terms of basketball success and every non-football sport, they're competitive, but all they've known is Power 5.
Right.
I think the difference in them and, a Wake Forest or Boston College is that you've got Duke's basketball kind of program to lean on. Whereas, Wake Forest and Boston College, it's like they don't really bring anything stability-wise to the table. They're a little bit easier to kind of throw in as an Oregon State, Washington State kind of school. So just kind of curious where you could see maybe Duke falling into things from that perspective.
Well, I think you have a realistic view on Duke. I think exactly that's where they are at. They're not as desirable as, let's say, Clemson or Florida State. The toughest competitor they have locally is North Carolina, because UNC is a strong program and it's a big state school. It would be more of what, let's say, a Big Ten might be more likely to lean towards. If they were trying to expand, if the ACC were to come apart, they would be an interesting fit, as well as Virginia, oddly enough. But then, it's not to say that Virginia Tech wouldn't be an attractive program. I think Duke would, though, be in that same spot where I would say they offer more than UConn in a lot of ways, only because the Duke name is so powerful. Coach K, what he built down there. For most of my life, I think I've only thought, and I'm in my 40s, but most of my college sports life, Duke basketball has been such a phenomenon. So I think that has helped them quite a bit. And again, pulling them into, they have facilities, they can be successful. It's not as easy as others, as far as football, I should say, but there is an expectation that you can win at Duke. It's not, those of us who are old enough definitely remember when Duke football was way, way worse than many who are younger would even realize. But I think you're right. I think they would have that kind of middle road attractiveness. I think they would certainly have an easier time than, let's say, Wake. Wake, I don't know where they would end up if the ACC were to break apart. I think Duke would be one that would be attractive to, let's say, the Big 12 in the same way UConn would be. And it's interesting, too, once you get past the ACC is such an interesting conference. I've never really seen it totally broken down on which teams would be the most attractive for where. I think Duke would be more attractive than Boston College because, again, it's more of a sports hotbed. You're pulling in, I think, a more interesting market. And again, I think it's a bigger name than Boston College historically, at least in the last 20, 30 years. Post Flutie with Boston College, it's certainly in football. So I think it's a good question. I think it. And where some of those teams would end up, I think I would caution, there haven't been signs the ACC is going to break apart anytime soon, only because Florida State clearly wanted to try and break them apart earlier this offseason. And then when they saw the bill, they realized, no, it can't be broken apart. We hired the lawyers that were too good to make this deal. But I think there will be a point where the ACC starts to look, with the moment the ACC gets, at the very least, when the ACC finally gets to their media deal renegotiation, I'm not sure when that is, but I know it's quite a few years, relatively speaking, from now. Then that all of a sudden, all those teams are going to come into play, and I think to some extent the SEC and the Big Ten are probably relieved, because I don't think those programs, those conferences, are in any rush to add teams in them. They don't get me wrong, they say that, and if Notre Dame were to knock on the door and say, like, let us in, they will say, of course we will. But until that moment gets forced, I think right now the Big Ten and the SEC are just happy to get ready for the fact that they're about to become enormous conferences. And how does that get managed? I mean, there was a good article, I think, in The Athletic talking about, right now the Big Ten is working on, like, how do we do all these non-revenue sports that now need to make a trip from Los Angeles to, Maryland or New Jersey? I mean, how are we gonna make that logistic work? So I think to some extent and I mean, that was one of the things that was kind of supposedly, from what the reports were seeing before Warren left the Big Ten, to take over be the president of the Bears. He wanted to add more teams to the Big Ten, and he was getting some resistance from the other Big Ten members. I think they were just happy to have made this huge jump to add the USC and UCLA, and they were kind of hesitant to add more. And I think maybe that would have been the immediate window for, let's say, a team like Oregon and Washington to head over. And that hesitancy, that carefulness, that small c kind of conservatism, being very kind of careful, is certainly what guided the Pac-12 to the point where probably to its detriment, because that's historically been the Pac-12's reputation. Like, we'll go slow, we'll go carefully, we'll go as a group, until the point that USC and UCLA just finally said, we can't take it anymore. We're going to take all the money at the Big Ten. Colorado said the same thing. We're going to just bail out. I mean, one of my favorite analogies that someone put out there was, I'm going to say, yes, Tyler, the user was Tylex123. When Colorado posted their official, we're heading to the Big 12, I cannot believe a team that went 1-11 last year just nuked the entire Pac-12 conference. To which case, Tiger Cat 92 said USC and UCLA built a bomb and the Buffs dropped it. So, and did they do it for the Barbenheimer memes? I don't know, but it's been definitely an interesting thing to see come together. As we slowly wrap this up, because we've been going now for almost an hour and a half, just wanted to mention, because we always like to kind of note the passing of teams, not that they've died, but Alderson Broadus, it was a Division II program in West Virginia. They were struggling for many years financially. Finally, it looks like they've been forced to close. They were a D2 football program and a sprint football program. What's sprint football? It's kind of a fun sport where there's a maximum weight limit. It's like 178. It's a regular football, tackle football, but all the players had to be under 178 pounds. The military academies kick butt at that. So usually it's everyone competing against Army and Navy. But they are closing. Both programs are closing everything because their financial situation, the state has said they can no longer grant degrees because of the financial. They were owing, I believe, like $700,000 in utility bills. A lot of problems there. So unfortunately, we're going to be saying goodbye to the battlers of D2. In addition, lots of other things going on in college football, but we're going to go ahead and slowly wrap this up. So my name is Bobak Hayeri. I want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to say, though, tomorrow at noon, we're going to have Phil Steele. He's going to be joining us for just an interview, about 30 minutes. It'll turn into a recording just like this. So on behalf of myself, Bobak Hayeri, on behalf of my co-host, Andrew Sagona, I want to thank all of you who joined us to give your thoughts on everything going on in college football. We do these every Tuesday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. So I want to go ahead and say I'm going to hang up and listen.